It was just after midnight, and I was pushing through the last stretch of a long haul. The highway was empty, nothing but dark road and the hum of my rig beneath me. I hadn't seen another car for miles, and the endless rows of pine trees were starting to blur together in my headlights. That's when I spotted her. At first, I thought I was seeing things. A woman standing on the shoulder of the road, her clothes torn and hair wild, waving frantically. I slowed down, trying to get a better look. She looked terrified, pale as a ghost, and something in her eyes told me she needed help. I debated whether to pull over. Years on the road had taught me to be careful, especially at night. But I couldn't leave her there. Something about the way she was trembling made me stop. I pulled the truck over to the side of the road and rolled down the window. "You okay?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Her voice was shaky. "My car broke down. I need a ride, please. I need to get to the next town." I hesitated. She looked rattled, and her clothes were dirty, torn at the edges like she had been through something rough. Against my better judgment, I unlocked the door. "All right, hop in." She climbed in, her hands still trembling. She barely looked at me, just stared straight ahead as I pulled back onto the highway. The silence between us was heavy, like something unspoken hung in the air. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Her breathing was shallow, and every few minutes, she'd glance over her shoulder as if expecting someone to be following us. I tried to make conversation, but she was distant, her responses clipped and anxious. "You all right?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "You seem spooked." She turned her head slowly toward me, her eyes wide and filled with fear. "He's following me," she whispered. I frowned. "Who's following you?" She didn't answer right away. Her eyes darted around the cab like she was looking for someone. I felt a chill run down my spine. "The man," she said quietly. "The man from the car. He was chasing me." I kept my eyes on the road, but my stomach knotted up. This was starting to feel like something more than just a broken-down car. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. Maybe she was just shaken up. But as we drove on, her agitation only grew. She kept muttering to herself, words I couldn't fully make out, but I could hear the fear in her voice. It was like she was talking to someone who wasn't there. A few miles passed in tense silence, and then I heard her say something that sent a shiver through me. "He's getting closer." I glanced over at her, but she was staring out the window, eyes wide and unblinking. My heart pounded in my chest. I scanned the road behind us through the mirrors. Nothing but darkness. No cars, no headlights, nothing. "Who's getting closer?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. She didn't respond. She just kept staring ahead, her breathing growing faster. My palms were sweating now, gripping the steering wheel tight. Something wasn't right. I knew I had to get to the next town, but every mile felt like an eternity. Then, just as I was about to say something else, I glanced over at her again. And she was gone. The passenger seat was empty. I slammed on the brakes, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might explode out of my chest. The truck screeched to a halt in the middle of the highway, tires squealing. I threw the door open and jumped out, my mind racing. I checked the back of the cab, the side of the road. There was no sign of her. She had just disappeared. I stood there, the cold night air biting into me, staring at the empty seat where she had been. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I was shaken, but there was no time to dwell on it. I needed to get off that highway. I climbed back into the truck and sped toward the next town, my hands trembling on the wheel. When I finally pulled into the truck stop, I stumbled out of the cab and made my way inside, my legs feeling like jelly. A couple of other drivers were sitting at the counter, and I walked up to them, my voice shaking as I told them what had happened. They listened quietly, their faces serious. When I finished, one of them, an older guy with graying hair, shook his head slowly. "You're not the first," he said. "What do you mean?" He looked at me with a grim expression. "That woman you picked up, she died out there. Car crash. It's been years now, but every once in a while, someone sees her. She's always asking for a ride, but she never makes it to town." I just stared at him, my mind spinning. I wanted to laugh it off, tell him it wasn't possible, that it had to be some kind of mistake. But deep down, I knew what I'd seen. I never drove that stretch of highway at night again. The memory of that woman, her pale face and terrified eyes, still haunts me. Maybe she's still out there, waiting for the next driver, hoping for a ride that'll never come. My name is Ethan, 39 years old, and I've been a trucker for nearly 2 decades now. You'd think that after driving for so long, the road would start feeling like home. For the most part, it did. The steady hum of the engine, the open stretches of highway, and the routine of hauling cargo from one state to another, it was all second nature. But this particular trip still haunts me. It was supposed to be a routine haul, nothing out of the ordinary. The cargo was marked as high value, which wasn't unusual in this line of work. It wasn't the first time I'd transported something expensive. But as soon as I loaded up the truck, something felt off. I couldn't quite place it. Maybe it was the unusually thick fog that clung to the highway, or the fact that I hadn't seen another vehicle in hours. I tried to shake it off, focusing on the job ahead. Deliver the cargo, get paid, and move on to the next haul. Simple. The road was eerily quiet, the fog swallowing up everything beyond the headlights. Every so often, I glanced in the rearview mirror, convinced that I saw a shadow or the faint flicker of headlights behind me. But each time I looked closer, there was nothing. Just darkness and the swirling fog. About halfway through the trip, the feeling that something wasn't right became impossible to ignore. My gut told me to pull over and check the cargo, even though I knew I'd locked it up tight at the start of the trip. I found a quiet spot on the side of the road, cut the engine, and stepped out into the fog. The air was damp, thick with moisture, and eerily silent. No crickets, no wind, just a heavy, oppressive quiet. I walked to the back of the truck, my heart pounding harder with every step. I told myself it was just nerves, that everything would be fine once I saw the cargo was still there. But when I unlocked the doors and swung them open, my stomach dropped. The back of the truck was completely empty. I stood there in stunned silence, staring at the bare floor of the trailer. It didn't make any sense. I had checked the cargo before I left. It had been there, securely packed and locked up. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken locks, no scratches on the doors. Nothing. It was like the cargo had vanished into thin air. I felt a chill creep down my spine as I grabbed my phone and dialed the authorities. I didn't know what else to do. When the dispatcher answered, I explained the situation as best I could. They sent out a patrol car to meet me, but when the officers arrived and inspected the truck, they found nothing. No evidence of theft, no tampering. It was as if the cargo had never been there in the first place. The officers were polite but skeptical. One of them, a young guy who couldn't have been more than 25, gave me a look that said he thought I was losing it. They took my statement, told me they'd file a report, and left me standing there in the fog, feeling more alone than ever. I didn't know what else to do but get back on the road. I was still shaking when I climbed back into the cab and started the engine. The fog seemed thicker now, pressing in on all sides. As I drove, my mind raced with possibilities. Had I been set up? Had someone stolen the cargo without leaving a trace? None of it made any sense. Then my phone rang. I almost didn't answer it. My hands were shaking so bad I nearly dropped it. But something in me told me to pick up. When I pressed the phone to my ear, a cold, distorted voice crackled through the line. "The cargo was never yours to deliver," the voice hissed. Those who know too much will be silenced. I froze, my heart slamming against my chest. Who is this? I demanded, but there was no answer. The line went dead. I slammed the phone down on the passenger seat, my mind spinning. Who had called me? How did they know about the cargo? And what did they mean by silenced? 1,000 questions raced through my head, none of them with any answers. I kept driving, my eyes darting to the mirrors every few seconds, half expecting to see headlights closing in behind me. But there was nothing, just the endless fog and the quiet hum of the engine. It was late by the time I reached my destination, but I couldn't relax. I parked the truck at the depot and climbed into the sleeper cab, too wired to sleep. That's when my phone rang again. The same distorted voice, but this time it was barely a whisper. "You're next." I hung up, my hands trembling uncontrollably. That was it. I couldn't take it anymore. The next morning, I called my boss and told him I was done. I quit trucking that day, sold the rig, and moved back home to be closer to family. But even now, years later, I still can't shake the feeling that someone's watching me, waiting. Every time my phone rings, I freeze, half expecting to hear that voice again, whispering from the other side of the line. My name is Jake. I'm 42 and have been driving trucks for more than 15 years. If there's one thing I've learned in this line of work, it's that the road can play tricks on you, especially during those long, lonely stretches at night when the world around you seems to blur into nothingness. But nothing prepared me for what I saw that night up in the mountains. I was on a late-night run, hauling freight through a desolate stretch of highway. The road snaked up into the mountains, and the fog had started to roll in, thick and heavy. Visibility was getting worse, and all I could see were the faint outlines of the trees on either side of the road. As I rounded a bend, I spotted 3 trucks ahead of me. They all had the same strange markings on their trailers, something like an old, faded logo I couldn't quite make out. I didn't think much of it at first and just fell in behind them, figuring I'd stick with them until the next stop. Safety in numbers, right? But after a few miles, I noticed something odd. The trucks were moving in perfect sync. They didn't speed up, slow down, or even wobble on the curves. It was like they were on rails, gliding effortlessly down the road. And as I got closer, I realized something even stranger. There were no drivers in the cabs. At first, I thought I was just tired, maybe seeing things. I rubbed my eyes, took a swig of coffee, and looked again. But no matter how many times I checked, the cabs were empty. My skin started to crawl, and my stomach knotted up. This wasn't right. The hours ticked by, and the trucks kept moving, never changing their speed, never breaking formation. My unease grew with each passing mile. I tried to ignore it, telling myself there had to be some logical explanation. Maybe it was a remote-controlled convoy or something high-tech I hadn't heard about. But deep down, I knew something was off. I decided I'd had enough. I wasn't going to spend another minute trailing behind those eerie, driverless trucks. I shifted gears and pressed down on the accelerator, ready to overtake them. But the moment I tried, my engine sputtered and died. My truck coasted to a stop on the shoulder of the road, the engine completely dead. I tried turning the key, but it wouldn't even crank. I was stranded in the middle of the mountains, with nothing but fog and those damn trucks in front of me. As I sat there, cursing under my breath and trying to figure out what the hell was going on, the convoy continued moving. Slowly but steadily, they glided away into the fog, disappearing like ghosts into the night. The only sound left was a faint, eerie static coming from my radio. No voices, no music, just static. Eventually, my truck roared back to life as if nothing had happened, and I got the hell out of there. When I finally made it to the next truck stop, I told the clerk what had happened. He listened, a strange look on his face, then leaned in close and said, "You're not the first one to see them. Those trucks. They're from an old smuggling ring. Got caught in a shootout with the police up in those mountains years ago. No one made it out alive. They say the trucks are still out there, patrolling the road, unfinished business keeping them going. I laughed it off, but it was forced. Deep down, I knew he was right. I still can't drive through the mountains without thinking about those trucks, and I always keep an eye on the rearview mirror, waiting for them to show up again.